And I'm live on YouTube, going live on Instagram. Okay, let me see. The StreamYard is loading. We are live on Instagram. I'm live on YouTube as well. Perfect. We can forget about anything technical and we can enjoy our conversation. Okay, hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back. If you're new to this page, I'm Marta, your host for How to Be a Psychic Medium retreat and the creator of the 10-week Psychic Mediumship Foundation course. That's the sponsor of this retreat. And this course is a sacred transformational space designed to help you awaken your intuitive gifts, strengthen your connection with spirit, and step confidently into the path of psychic mediumship. Together, we explore grounding, energy protection, working with spirit guides, angels, and loved ones, strengthening your clairs, and so much more. I am mentioning about it because we're beginning the next round in just a couple of weeks. You can find the link on my Instagram bio, or if you're part of this retreat, head over to the What to Do Next module and you will find a welcome video, step-by-step guide, and beautiful testimonials from students who have already walked this path. And if you've joined us for day 3 yesterday opening ceremony, you might remember I played one of those heartfelt testimonials live. And if you're curious or feeling called because you might be watching that video in the future, I warmly invite you to DM me or send me an email to info@martha.medium. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's extraordinary guest. I'm going to bring her to the stage and I'm then going to do the official introduction. Hello, welcome, Katie.
Hello. Thank you. Happy
Hello.
to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for having you with us. So, Katie Cercone Orna is an artist and yogi of over 20
Mhm.
years, hailing from the Blessed Coast. A long-time Kundalini student of Siri Rishi, Orna received her 200-hour YTT with Mama Medicine and has led sacred arts rituals in venues throughout the US, UK, and Asia. Cercone has exhibited art at the Brooklyn Museum, Bronx Museum, Whitney Museum, Dallas Contemporary, Momenta Art, C24 Gallery, and Changjiang Museum of Contemporary Art in China. Her work has been featured in Dazed, Milk, Interview, Japan Times, Huffington Post, Hysteria, Art Papers, Art21, Paper, and the Washington Post. A pioneer of hip hop yoga since 2011, Katie was a 2015 JUSFC Fellow and received a Franklin Furnace Pant Award for Performance Art in 2021. Cercone is adjunct faculty at the School of Visual Arts, where she teaches gender trouble in the Visual and Critical Studies department. Follow her on Instagram at parvati_slice and learn more at katiecercone.com. Katie, welcome. I am so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this.
Let's go with the flow. Let's begin that beautiful conversation. I would love to start with your current focus, astro, feminism, such a rich and fascinating space. Katie, how would you describe astrofeminism in your own words, and why does it feel meaningful not just as a concept, but as something alive and necessary right now in this cultural moment?
Mm. Yeah, so I've always known a little bit about astrology and started listening to more podcasts kind of regularly, especially sort of trying to create this rhythm of life that's more around moon right? A lot of my interest in astrology began there, and it's actually through one of my artist friends, who I was working on a feminist magazine at the time. Her name is Yana. She introduced me to astrofeminism, which is a very kind of small niche within astrology. And yet, I think for me, it kind of represents what came before. I also like the astrologer Alice Sparkley Cat. She wrote a book called Post Colonial Astrology. I also often refer to astrofeminism as matrifocal astrology, or just this kind of weaving of matrifocal wisdoms. My understanding is that we all come from the same place, and a lot of the more solidified religions, are sort of, they're all kind of dealing with the same truth and the same sort of archetypes. So for me, astrofeminism is both decolonizing astrology as we know it in the West, right, which trickles down from Greek and Roman mythology. I like to call, I like astrology and I use it and I think it works in the West, but it also, as we know it, glorifies toxic masculinity, violence against women. A lot of these male gods that are like the center of Western astrology are also rapists and, eating their daughters or just doing horrendous things, which is part of the shadow work aspect. However, prior to the archetypes we have today, which are very limited and often two-dimensional, and, the goddesses became demoted to brides and wives, right? Of these
Mm-hmm.
battlemonger, wife beater, kind of glorified toxic masculinity. So astrofeminism for me is a reclaiming of all the feminine archetypes. It's a recentering of the moon, right? Even in Western astrology, we orient around the sun, which is masculine. It's ego, right? Whereas the moon is roots. It's feminine. It's the earth. Same goes for Venus. And then we have all of these new asteroids emerging, which have always been there, but they're emerging to human consciousness. And astrology, even if we're just thinking about modern contemporary astrology, it's evolving a lot. And the new asteroids, which I call the feminist asteroids or the queer asteroids, are often being named for indigenous creator gods, um, more queer gods, more female or feminist archetypes that are more nuanced. And so, in that sense, it's kind of rewriting the narrative, decolonizing yoga. And that's sort of where I like to, start from in astrology, rather than just thinking about the sun or kind of capitulating to the misogyny that's sort of underlying a lot of the pop culture, right, that we receive and often take at face value.
Mm, thank you. I have so many questions. I would
Mhm.
love to start if you can expand a little bit. How do you personally understand, well, feminism today? Then I know you've touched upon, but what does it mean to you beyond the popular slogans or surface level definitions, especially since you've already started talking, you weave it together with astrology, but I'm curious when you bring astrology and feminism together in your practice, what kinds of tensions or truths arise? I know you've mentioned a couple of them, but I'm curious what happens when you weave the cosmic alongside the societal, the spiritual, alongside the political?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's one reason why I kind of arrived at astrology, is I think it starts to help us become comfortable with paradox, with multiplicity. I think at the most basic level, it's just about opening your heart. So, for an
Mm.
example, I feel like my journey with feminism has been very, very long one. Like, it almost began more from this place of, we talked about disordered eating, and how does feminism makes sense for young women, right? Who are coming of age in a world that is telling them they're not enough, they're not thin enough, pretty enough. And often that's more just a kind of mechanism that sells, widgets or gadgets or, things that then we become attached to as women. So I feel that, early on, like I started to hit walls within feminism where I just felt like um maybe it wasn't something. I don't know, it's never that I would not call myself a feminist, but I do feel like now I feel sort of estranged from mainstream feminism and from what I perceive as the kind of most urgent or prominent issues of mainstream feminism, which would be like abortion or
Mhm.
fighting like Republicans and stuff. Like I really have, it's always been so personal for me, and I feel like it's involved like just kind of peeling away the layers of a lot of the conditioning I grew up with and the gender role that I was sort of
Mm.
arriving at given the environment I grew up in, wanting to kind of not follow in my mom's footsteps. Sometimes like feminism was like, I'll follow in my father's footsteps, right? And I'll be
Mhm.
powerful and I will beat men at their own game. I feel like that was sort of for
Mm.
me the feminism that was lacking in maturity or lacking in a more holistic lens where like,
Mhm.
all right, I'm just gonna go out there and, beat the patriarchy or be
Mhm.
angry. And I think it's like we have all of these like developmentally appropriate stages.
Mhm.
Like even at a certain point, like when I went to grad school, I got really interested in hip hop, and like part of that was almost fueled by this sense that like I believed it was full of misogyny, right? That's sort of like one thing that we notice about hip hop, especially if we're coming from feminism, is like there's misogyny in hip hop, right? Just as there's misogyny everywhere. But I feel like as the artist in me has always tried to create these kind of hybrid spaces, because the more I sort of pigeonholed myself in one career or one path or one ideology, I just found that it was really limited and there was people that were out of integrity, and there's sort of a hypocrisy, right, that's always happening. Or even within any
Mm.
sort of progressive movement, what I've found happens is that we start to, become exclusionary within the movement and start to ask, like, we're forming a new group around this idea. So we're going to weed out the people that aren't behaving. And it just becomes
Mm.
this like, same process of like, gatekeeping and bullying and the so
Mm.
I just find that like my experience is like I'm not trying to call out any one person, or I just have found that like my spiritual teachers, my feminist mentors, like everyone, is a human being and they have their shadow work. And I've always just felt like I'm searching for something that I can land in and feel like can fully subscribe to. And I think astrology is a lens that I feel like it's broad enough and complex enough, and that bringing my feminism into that allows me to like weed out the parts of astrology that I feel like are more remnants of white male patriarchy or more fueled by this capitalist system, right? Where certain people are using astrology in ways that are out of integrity, just like a lot of feminism or a lot of, anti-racism has become watered
Mhm.
down and sort of sold to the masses. Or I don't like riding trends, and I feel like it's almost like I'm starting to see how ways that I might just appear complacent, but I don't really like to do activism with a hashtag, even though I use them, I just feel like whether it's capitalism or it's just human nature, like we're always sort of like jumping into the next urgent moment and whatever that is, and then that moment's gone and we go back to like looking for the next thing. I feel like I want to I want something that's like we can really establish as moral and ethical, that's like a framework that we can all subscribe to. And
Mm,
I think astrology helps us to see beyond gender and beyond race and a lot of these binaries that we subscribe to or we're sort of forced to, right? Because we often have to just accept the way others see us, and ignore, and like as a woman, right? We're often
mm,
sexualized, we're projected onto, we're kind of put in this box and limited and kept out of certain spaces, right? Just as people of color, and there's all these kind of nuances and microaggressions that happen. But I feel like, yeah, like that's one thing with all of my you know creative explorations is I like finding, things that maybe seem really at odds and then kind of finding the common ground,
mm,
finding the commonalities, or
mhm,
finding like the freedom within a space like hip hop yoga. And I also find that there are ways that kind of backfires, or people don't get it, or it doesn't create long-term financial um, sustainability always, right? Because it's a little bit hard to understand when we're not like choosing one path or one answer. I don't know that I subscribe to that anymore. I think
mhm.
it's like everyone's having a really unique journey, and I can speak to mine and just kind of let the right people hear it when they're ready, right, to kind of digest the message I have to bring.
Mm, beautiful. One thing I sense so strongly, well, I sense many things, but one that I would like to concentrate. So, something that's so strong in your work is this idea of cosmic embodiment, not just intellectual ideas, but lived, felt, embodied experience. So, how do you understand cosmic embodiment in your life and art? And how can it help us move beyond abstraction and into something truly transformational?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. And that's really something that seems to resurface in my life and in my work. Like for me, I was very nerdy. I was kind of like a teacher's pet and got good grades. And I loved reading, but I also found that I hid in books, like almost that was sort of a way that I almost like a form of escapism. And even my eating disorder, I see it as a mental health issue. So I feel like this like neuroses is a real thing, overthinking is a real thing, and I've always been told I'm a great writer, right? But I also find that language is really limited, so as I like hit up against that wall, and acknowledge the limitations of language, and acknowledge like the damage overthinking has caused in my life, from being neurotic, not being grounded, living in a fantasy world, even if that's books or something that's seemingly kind of wholesome or healthy. I really felt like I've often lost touch with that embodied experience, and it's not something that culturally was considered valuable or important in my family growing up. I found it was really something that was lacking and missing. So yoga has been really important for me in that sense. I started practicing yoga when I was 13, and it was just like at that point, at a certain point, it became this like constant in my life and something I really needed. So I think, when I think of like initially like this idea of like cosmic embodiment, I think of the meditations I do, whether they're chanting or breath work. Every morning I start out my day with yoga and meditation, and that helps me get grounded and kind of balance out that the neuroses and the monkey mind, because it's not that it's like inherently bad. but I always tell my yoga students, like, we rather than seeing the mind as a tool, we become a tool of the mind, right? So we start to think that we are our thoughts, or that our thoughts are the, totality of existence, when, yogis, we say that the true mind lies in the heart. We also have intelligence in our gut, in our third eye, in our yoni, right? The sacred divine feminine, really the center of intelligence, of creative intelligence. We think of that as, the womb, the yoni in Sanskrit. And I also will mention, when I was in grad school, I had studied feminist art and kind of decided at that point I wanted to be an artist. But a lot of my success, especially like right after grad school, came out with this collaborative feminist collective that I sort of became involved in, sort of spontaneously or organically. We just started performing, and we were calling it embodied feminism, because for me, I was the one writing the grants and kind of bringing the intersectional feminists and the feminist theory and the queer theory, because that's what I majored in college. But in that process, I also realized, oh, I don't want to be trapped in the ivory tower. I don't see myself as being stuck in this language of feminism and fighting. Academia is very entrenched in white male power structures, and it's not a reflection of the real world. And I felt like there's sort of a ceiling in that sense for academic feminism. So I said, okay, feminist art, I think art, right, which kind of transcends language, is a much more powerful way to approach this mission, right, of feminists, of gender equality, of gender nonconformity, anti-racism. For me, feminism must be intersexual. We need to think about, how race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, all of these things intersect in terms of our gender identity and our privilege. But yeah, I say all that to say, so our collective, we would just get together and perform and try to embody. Sometimes it was more of like a goddess, or just using our voices and like behaving in this way that was a kind of counter, like an antidote to the conditioning that I experienced as a daughter of the white male patriarchy. And sort of how, even despite myself, no matter what I think of myself as being empowered, or all of us are very liberated here in the West, speaking for women, compared to other places in the world where you aren't allowed to get an education, or there's some very extreme violence of women happening that happens less so here. But I think it was like a way of getting out of our heads, of like applying the feminist theory, but making it embodied and kind of channeling something primordial, something spontaneous. And so a lot of really unexpected blessings came through that work, of talking about embodied feminism, and sort of doing that on the street, at art fairs, art galleries. We performed everywhere with everyone. But a lot of it was like wanting to take feminism out of the books, right, out of the ivory tower. Yeah.
I love it. And I will be asking you questions about your art as well, but I know there are many, many viewers who are new to certain concepts that you're mentioning now. What I love about your work and your person, there's so many things, but you're clearly engaging in critique and disruption, and almost like you speak openly about cultural myths, systems that are so much in need of reimagining. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your reflections on patriarchy, capitalism, gender binaries. Um, I would love for you maybe to talk a little bit more about collective healing, collective energy. How do you feel the collective is moving or shifting right now? And are we crossing a particular emotional or spiritual threshold? And how does your work engage or respond to that larger collective feeling?
Yeah, I feel like it's complicated to even speak publicly at all right now because there are many, many crises in the world and people that truly need our help and deserve deserve
Mm,
to have basic human rights. And so that's complicated by the fact that we're all living our own lives and we all have our unique problems. And I've been personally fighting a lot of battles that I never imagined I would be, dealing with housing insecurity, poverty,
mm,
food insecurity, because I'm a single mother. So I haven't felt like I've been able to show up as much as activists in ways that I would like to, given, right, all the urgency of the environmental crisis and all of the wars, ongoing genocides. I'm not even going to talk about politics and our president, who I don't like to mention. But a lot of people who are just like, now's the time. And I am not here to argue with that at all. Now is the time to protest and fight for your rights. And I've done a lot of fighting. And on that note, I feel like there's, a lot of like the spiritual teachers, some of them I follow or have followed for years, like we've talked about this kind of splitting of worlds, right? Where almost like maybe it's real, maybe it's more of a metaphor of sort of understanding just consciousness. I really feel that we attract people that are of our equal vibration, right? The dark attracts the light, but also in terms of like intimacy and healthy adult relationships and reciprocal relationships. I find that a lot of the spaces I'm moving in are so beautiful and high vibe right now. And I think I do make sense of this kind of like one world is elevating and one world is kind of falling away, and some people are choosing death. Others are certainly victims of their circumstances. But I think I want to challenge victim consciousness as well as a feminist, and it's something I've had to really look deeply at. Even acknowledging like I've had to almost play the victim to uh, earn back basic human rights, like, right, working with
mm,
the system, living in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Like, I do understand victim consciousness. At the same time, I think it's disempowering and it's kind of part of that binary. And I sort of believe we're all both, right? Like, we're all empaths and narcissists, right? But our experience is kind of like, push us to be one or the other. And I think astrology is like, bottom line, we're here to grow, and our ego is going to fight that, right? But our soul reincarnated with a specific mission. So I think, when you look at your chart, you start to understand your mission and how some of the setbacks, some of the conflicts, some of the deep pain, right? I might have white privilege, or we all have these sort of privileges, and people might look at us and want what we have, but they probably don't really understand our pain or our shame or our sadness or what we've kind of reincarnated to learn, and how that's really humbling, right? Doing that work. So I think we are at a threshold. I even astrologically, people, all the astrologers are saying Saturn just moved into a new sign. This is like a new beginning. Pluto moved into Aquarius recently. Like, I think it is a beautiful time to connect to higher consciousness. I think there's a lot of beautiful things happening in community and people building back the world and making change. And I think the young people that are coming in and growing up are going to continue to make tremendous change. I think the backlash we're experiencing now with certain fascist, dictators in operation around the world, that's also a result of the progress we've made and the revolutions that have been in process for a long time. So I feel pretty blessed right now. I feel positive that there's a lot of people doing the work and, understanding that they're here and they have opportunity to participate in, this kind of spiritual reckoning and awaken and choose choose the light, right? And we do that by working with the shadow, right? Consciously.
Mm, thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the community you've been building and about hip hop yoga? I'm sure that will be of such value to so many viewers here.
Yeah, so like anything, it's a complex journey, and like I live in New York, right? So there's a very, vast hip hop community here. There's a lot of people that actually participated in the birth of hip hop and were there to kind of see and experience and codify, hip hop as we know it. And then we also have a lot of people that have kind of forgotten and have maybe just gotten the watered down, commercialized version, or have, the sell out type of hip hop. So, when I was in graduate school, I really fell in love with hip hop. And that was just a product of living in Brooklyn and being introduced to the music and the culture, and showing up to participate, and also getting my yoga teacher training. At the time, I started to observe that hip hop and yoga had a lot of interesting similarities and overlaps in some of the movement, and some of the underlying spiritual principles. And so I started to learn a lot, and then that kind of unfolded in some of my art practice. I wrote my thesis on the spirituality of hip hop, which again, it's like I only really thought that was interesting and exciting because I was coming from this place of having seen more commercial, having a limited understanding of hip hop, where I felt like it was not spiritual, right? But I think now my understanding is more like, thinking about this kind of primordial goddess energy. Like for me, that is hip hop. It's
Mm,
like the heartbeat of the mother. It's like it's the
mm,
drum, right? It is like the danced prayer on the earth, and some people don't like what I have to say because it's my white privilege, and I get a lot of like cultural appropriation both for hip hop and yoga, right? I grew up in California. I grew up in the suburbs. I have white privilege. I personally don't believe my family is white. I think that they assimilated into white culture because
mhm,
I'm Italian, Irish, and from my understanding that my relatives were non-white and they were also colonized. And so part of that is like finding this lineage for me that speaks to something deeper. So I feel like hip hop, on the one hand, it is kind of like very habit forming. On another hand, I feel like it's for me like represents this kind of heart of spirituality and of community. So one way that manifested in my life was doing a urban mystery school, and that was with my partner at the time, was more of an OG conscious rapper, and so we were inviting people into the cipher and getting people rapping and also adding yoga and movement. We did some retreats in Thailand and kind of just showed up in different ways, sharing hip hop yoga, whether it was a workshop, whether it was a retreat. I've also started doing a performance practice that was more personal to me and just about my own voice and needing to stand in my power and kind of um, share this understanding of hip hop yoga with the world. So it's something I've done kind of more as a solo
Oh,
artist, but also
we
as
are
a
back. Oh,
practitioner.
we're back. Mhm.
Okay. So yeah. Um, but again, I think if you're interested in yoga, one of the best ways is just to come to my yoga class. I teach at the first Black female owned yoga studio in Crown Heights. It's called Urban Asana. That's more of a community hatha vinyasa flow. But it's a very like unique community, and just this notion of urban asana, it's intentionally made accessible, right, to people that aren't necessarily looking for a pretentious kind of luxury
Mm.
colonized yoga experience.
I have to ask you about that because you
Mm.
navigate a tricky space as a spiritual artist and teacher, the tension between authentic service and the commodification of spirituality in today's world. How do you personally navigate that? How do you stay grounded and discerning when the online world often rewards surface or aesthetic over depth?
Mm. Yeah, the online world can be very triggering, and is like I like memes. Like I love memes and how they say so much in a little bit, and they're so powerful. And right now, like I love how, activated everyone is, and decolonizing yoga, and like I think that's all great. I also kind of chuckle as someone who can be like on both sides, right? Of like, it's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to look at me at a surface level and
Mm-hmm.
just, say that I'm a cultural appropriator, or, I think it's funny because I more came from this place of actually really disliking spiritual community. Like that was where I began. I didn't
Mm.
like the goddess, and that was actually for me personally, by growing up in California, I was always felt sort of surrounded by new age culture, but what I was observing was more the hypocrisy and the shadow side of it, of like, why are we saying that we're all equal when society is segregated and all the rich beautiful people are leading these spiritual journeys, and then turning around and having multiple wives and fast cars, and like it just felt like everyone is lying. And I'm a Scorpio, I have a Scorpio stellium, so it's like I always
Mm.
wanted to be that truth bomb, right, where like I had to kind of like reject my mother's feminism and my mother's healing. But then it's like the irony of that is I feel like in many ways I've just become this caricature of like almost like my worst nightmare, because it's just like we can run from one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, I think especially through traveling, I've just found that like we're all the same. We want the same things. We want attention, we want love, and we all are totally unique, right? And we have different ways of self-sabotaging. But I think like there are these universal truths, and I think all the main religions and the spiritual traditions really boil down to that. I think it's our humanity that's flawed, right? That's like power corrupts, and even when you look at all the yogis, especially the male teachers that brought yoga to this country, there's been a lot of abuse of power, and there's been a lot of
Mm.
especially, like perversions and things that have just gotten muddled up, and
Mm.
people were not really able to wield their power in conscious ways. So I think that shouldn't take away from the power of these tools. But I think that, that's one reason I'm kind of all over the place too, or I'm like, it's yoga, it's hip hop yoga, it's feminism, it's astrofeminism. It's like, because I'm
Mm-hmm.
still looking for that truth that's like pure, that's uncorrupted, but I think it's like it's us. Right? And so it's like astrology is allowed me to go deep inside to of myself, and almost acknowledge that, it's like we have to acknowledge the truth that's dark, but we can't get stuck there. So like part of my work recently is almost being like just being present and being more willing to stay at surface level, I guess, which is for me uniquely as a Scorpio. I can get in such a dark place of despair and like, right, it's like I feel like I searched for so long for the truth, and all I found was that just like everyone's an asshole and like it's all relative. So I think that's why astrology works for me, is like I can see that I'm coming from a very specific place, and what's helpful for me isn't necessarily helpful for the next person, right? But I can own all of those negative attributes in myself and start there. Like, what part of me is a narcissist, or what part of me is, being greedy or acting out of integrity? It's like, if we can point the finger and call someone out for it, there's probably some way that that's still operating within inside of us. So I think it's like that mirror, and we're always working and trying to be more accountable and more in integrity. But I think that that's not a reason to tear everything down. A lot of these tools are powerful, but they're also misunderstood, and I don't like deifying teachers. I want to accept, right, the good and bad, and kind of see the totality of our leaders and mentors and guides, right?
Mm, thank you. I am Scorpio rising, so I like to go deep.
Yeah.
Uh, Under capitalism, you've been mentioning there's so much pressure to package and market everything, even healing, even art, even activism. So do you see your work as as a kind of resistance to capitalist frameworks, or was it in the past? And how do creativity, ritual, or community help you imagine alternatives, or maybe, as you've mentioned, the totality?
Mm. Yeah, that's such a good question and a complex one, and something I wrestle with, and kind of have certain internal conflictions around. I think as an artist, I feel like there's this natural resistance to capitalism, or it's almost like I chose art because that allows me to kind of like slither around and color outside of the lines and sort of resist, codifying myself. Or even when we talk about cultural appropriation, like nothing is new, and all of the spiritual teachers and leaders, when you look around, they've just had the audacity to kind of like trademark some ancient system and put a little spin on it, and then write their book and create their following, and then they have people marketing them, and that's all works. I think our society rewards narcissism, and I go through phases of like trying to just like push myself to step up to bat, right? And like, and yet it's like every part of me often resists. Like, even with, for instance, something like yoga, it's like I believe it can help you, yoga or astrology, it can help you fix any problem in your life, whether you're dealing with a chronic illness, or it's a mental health
Mm,
issue, or you want to lose weight, or you want to make more money, if you want to find love. I think it's there. It's all like the answers are inside, right? But what I don't like, and what I feel like I will never do, is sell my work by kind of hooking people in. I feel like people saying, well, buy this and you'll find your
mm,
soulmate. Or if you want to lose weight, do this, or
mm,
even like in a worse extreme, like, these healers that are like, someone put a spell on you and you need to buy this from me so I can undo that,
mm,
right? It's almost like we're selling based on fears and fantasies, when I feel like if you're wielding these modalities correctly, it's actually more about being present, right? And we're not like urgently pushing someone to open their wallet. I mean, obviously, like, we want to guide them and we want to believe in our work. And I think that's the other side of it, is a lot of people that are more creative, sensitive, empath types. It's like they also have this own way of undercutting the value of what they're bringing. They're not able to show up as confidently. They don't want to feel like they're lying or selling or, on a power trip. And yet I'm trying to figure out, like, for myself, I want to be more intentional, and I do want to create something that creates sustainable wealth, because I realize the way I've run my art practice and my life, it's been kind of like boundaryless, right? And I've created a lot of magic, and a lot of the beautiful, most healing experiences I've had were co-created in a kind of spontaneous way. And I want to continue to invite in that flow state. But I really realize at this age that I have to kind of create a foundation so that I'm a little more intentional about how I'm using my energy, what I'm offering. So, sort of like, I'm setting the framework for how people can come to me if they want my services, rather than sort of responding or
Mm,
reacting to the world from a place of crisis, or responding to everyone else's crisis, or when everyone else is asked. Like, I think when we can maybe do some of the work around our shame or our envy or jealousy,
mm,
or we can release some of the, like, emotional baggage, and then we can be more neutral in our relationship to money and say, okay, well, I want to set up a sustainable business that helps people. I think a lot of my previous artwork, whether it was celebrated or whether I was kind of canceled and hated for it, it was for me. It was healing me. And, like, I'm the only one that can really see how much growth there has been and how I have deeply needed this experience, all of it, right? But moving forward, I'm like, I want the satisfaction of knowing I'm helping other people and creating a service of value. And I have to create a structure that's built to last, right? And so that is something I'm working on. It doesn't have to make me, a crude capitalist, or it's like there's the
mhm,
difference between, like, going in with an agenda in terms of wanting to exploit or get ahead or manufacture a certain results, versus when we
mm,
go in with no agenda and we kind of fall back on our own self-loathing or our own self-interest, right? So it's like, I think it's that balance of, like, not bringing so much expectation that we kind of cut off the creative flow, not needing to put the results before the process and the practice. But it's like, it depends on where we're coming from and what our experience is. I think especially for a lot of spiritual people, they need more structure, and they need to kind of create a long-term strategic plan that includes them in their circle of well-being and includes their comfort and wellness, right?
mm. Absolutely. Well, you've mentioned today patriarchy. Yes, I still have to ask you one question. What aspects, on that, what aspects of patriarchal conditioning do you most want to help people unravel or heal? And how does astrology, through a feminist lens, help us reclaim or rewrite the stories we've been told about power, identity, and
Mm.
destiny?
Yeah, um well, it's like, one thing I like about astrology is there's ways we can think about feminine energy in a way that transcends biology, right? Whether in gender identity. And so, I think about, like, water signs. Like, I have a lot of water, and they tend to be more empathic, more spiritual. But in that sense, it can also kind of be, using emotions to manipulate people, or passive aggression, or giving too much, at the expense of self, and becoming a martyr. So those are more traditionally feminine experiences, right? Whereas even in astrology, we saw that certain elements, water and earth, were assigned feminine, air and fire were assigned a masculine energy, and actually kind of put in this hierarchy where even today part of astrofeminism is kind of correcting the absence of more evolved, nuanced, the multiplicity of the feminine, right? The creator, the destroyer, the mother, the whore. Like, it's like we can all be all of those things, the maiden, mother, crone. So I think, like, I love that astrology, you can look at just, well, how much water do they have in their chart? Okay, so this is a man that's actually showing up like the compassionate mother and giving too much, and it's backfiring, right? Because the world is like, you can't cry, you're just here to, be this kind of hardened definition of masculinity that isn't serving anyone. So I feel like I'm in a place where I want it to be less about calling out particular people or shaming and blaming, and sort of allowing us all to experience this kind of this marriage of our masculine and feminine energy, which I think, the mystics listening understand that's kind of basic building block of a lot of the spiritual traditions, right? Of meditating, of yoga, this kind of like balance of yin yang, Shiva Shakti, the solar and the lunar energy. So I feel like part of that is reclaiming, like, as women, we often attract men that kind of fulfill this part of us that is dormant, or that we're not allowing ourselves to step into, right? So even when I think of like why I've started rapping, it was like, for me at first, I just was so drawn to this community and felt like it was, like, really just seeing it as something outside of myself, but wanting to find that outlet, a place to express my anger, a place to be more embodied in my sexuality. That was the way I perceived it, because of the way I was conditioned and the way I was operating, and kind of conforming to a certain cultural role. So, I find that astrofeminism just sort of highlights how limited the archetypes of the feminine have been. If we think about Venus and the moon, it's kind of like the mother and the lover. And it very much sort of like subscribes to this virgin whore dichotomy where, like, you're either a good woman or you're a fallen woman, And so I like that a lot of the outerlying asteroids are very queer and very, kind of like there's a multiplicity of gender expression that's coming in through some of these indigenous creator gods, or Cirrus, and we sort of see the trajectory when we look at myth. We don't just see these kind of isolated cookie cutter two-dimensional stereotypical roles, where it's like, even as a feminist, of like, comparatively to my mother or my grandmother, right? I was coming in like this raging, like, feminist. It was just like, tear it all down, and yet, like, understanding and coming of age, I love mythology because there's this, like, all of these archetypes. And I think what we don't want to do is like find our archetype and hang our hook there and then sort of use it to justify bad behavior of like, I'm really interested in Kali, so I'm just going to castrate every man that I'm interested in, and I'm just going to like talk over everyone and whip out my sword anytime I sense danger. It's like, Kali is a beautiful archetype when we're not speaking up for ourselves, when we don't think our voice matters. And a lot of women, I think, haven't even gotten to the place where they can acknowledge how they're censoring themselves, how they're being fake, how they're not
Mm.
communicating authentically in their relationships, and maybe they're doing it in some but not others, right? And so it's like we have to keep raising the bar on our own evolution wherever we're at, and that takes a lot of consciousness and kind of paying attention and acknowledging certain people come into our lives to teach us to grow and to, maybe they're playing kind of a victimizer role. But we have to really honor that sometimes. It's not that we accept violence, but it's like maybe this is our opportunity to speak up for ourselves and like speak up
Mm-hmm.
when someone hurts us. Because what I often see is women, especially women that are like traditionally feminine, is that we see the good in everyone, right? And we keep giving and we keep forgiving people for hurting us, And it's not to say
Mm.
that you can't do that if you're a man or if you're gay, or that there's a lot of women that are also acting like men and that are just found that the solution is to perpetuate toxic masculinity or to weaponize femininity, right? And extort men
Mm-hmm.
financially through seduction and through, you
Mm.
know, beauty that is kind of weaponized, right? So I think it's like astrology, even if we just think about it, this level of storytelling, right? It's like everyone tells the story differently. And it's almost just a tool of divination that allows you to center yourself in your own experience and see what's there, right? And really learn from that mirror of reality and face it consciously, rather than, a lot of what we're doing, whether we know it or not, is sort of distracting ourselves away from the real work, right? And like postponing the experience and then blaming it on someone else, right? When we don't get what we want, or blaming it on capitalism. It's like, I don't want to fall into that trap either. I know I have to participate in the system as it is and show up as it is. But part of that can be, right, this sort of disruptive energy. And especially now, I think there's a lot of space for that. And yet, it's like we're gonna make mistakes, right? And sometimes like what's disruptive and regenerative for us could also really trigger someone else, or cause damage at the same time, right? There's no sort of simple one size fits all liberation, and we have to recognize that these energy ripples out, and it affects people, how they're gonna feel affected personally by your actions.
I have three more questions that I would like to ask you as we are getting to an end. Well, we're not limited by time, but yes, I'm realizing that we've been speaking and for a while. And then with Katie, well, I had a pleasure to have her on my podcast as well. So you can go to Perfectly Imperfect Spiritual Podcast as well. But I have to ask you, what practices or reminders help keep you anchored in the realness of this work? Because on a more personal note, something I've been reflecting on lately is how easy it is, especially online, to get caught in the performance of spirituality we've been talking about,
Mm.
and how much courage it takes to stay in the raw, real, sometimes messy process of genuine spiritual connection.
Yeah. I think it's like so complex too. And for me, it's been like very cyclical. Like, at a certain point, it was like very empowering to perform into this in the street and raise my voice and be a bitch. Like the first feminist job I had was working at Bitch Magazine, right? And it's like that word has been reclaimed. And I think for some of us, like claiming that inner bitch is really empowering. And for others,
Mm-hmm.
I would say you're not allowed to use the word bitch. You're not allowed to call women bitches,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's
Mm-hmm.
all contextual, and there's words can be really hurtful. They can also be reclaimed. And so I think I use different practices. Like I've been working a lot with the Parvati mantra, which is actually my Instagram name right now. And one way that came to be is actually I named my son Kali. And, in that stage of life, which is a little more my hardcore feminist stage, I was really interested in Kali. And I still love, all of
Mm-hmm.
the mythology, and have done a deep dive into that energy. And I also found that at a certain point I really wanted, like I've I've seen that Shiva is like the consort of Kali, but he's also the consort of Parvati. So here's where we find that, truth be told, there's a lot of like colorism or racism like embedded in a lot of these traditions, right? We even have to check ourselves when we're saying like the shadow work and the light, or the language we use, right, is not neutral when we have black magic and white magic. And so Parvati is actually the white wife of Shiva, and Kali is the black mistress, right? Or like in a certain way, there's this, again, like when we're decolonizing astrology, even Hindu astrology, where I don't have as much immersion in the culture to really make a full-blown feminist critique or a critique, right? I think scholars in India have highlighted how a lot of people don't feel Kali is feminist at all, and that's sort of a projection of the Western women. And I think maybe that's true and not true both at the same time. So that to be said, I've just, for my own journey, Parvati is the goddess of yoga, and she's the wife of Shiva. And, that's just been a place that I'm in my life where I want to work more on cultivating this sacred marriage. So Parvati and Shiva represents the sacred marriage, um, both within and with your sort of
Mm.
soulmate or your divine consort. So I feel like the part of me that was really drawn to Kali was like really wanted to destroy patriarchy and like and almost like live in a matriarchy, right? Whereas like live in this place where women just take the power back. And I feel like there is a real necessity to do that in some places, in some instances. And I've found in my own life, despite me, that like Kali has come out and has had to just been this ferocious, angry feminist presence that like I didn't even know I had in me. But on that note, like having got to that point, I've been chanting to Parvati and really want to kind of focus in on the sacred marriage and the balance and the kind of bliss and being more in my feminine and my soft girl era and kind of attracting things rather than sort of playing the masculine role, because I feel like it gives me the upper hand, or I can control it, or it makes me less vulnerable, right, under patriarchy. So there's that. And I also just love using astrology as a tool in my life, even if it's not like working with a client. I feel like it's like hard for me not to talk about astrology, where I'm like, oh, that's because that you're a Scorpio rising, or
Mm.
oh, like it's endless what I discover, in my sort of healing journey of how like other people are directly triggering my Chiron, right? I'm having this emotional experience that I'm going through, and I'm like, oh, because this person's South Node is on my Chiron, which is like, that means we have a past life connection, and this person is here to help me really go deeply to those wounds. And it's really
Mm.
painful. But that acknowledgement allows me to kind of shift out of victim and sort of embrace the uncomfortable feeling of growth, or of just being present to emotions. Like last weekend, I just had a lot of sadness and anger coming up, and it's like, this again, am I ever going to get out of this? But astrology is kind of like gives me the map, right? Or like, oh wow, Chiron, the pain is the medicine. Wow, my Chiron is on my North Node, which is sort of really says I am a healer, and my pain will allow me to grow and then find the compassion to share these tools with other people. And I don't like to pretend like I haven't figured it out or be like, oh, I have a huge
Mm.
waiting list and you really want to work with me because everyone else does. It's like, no, I just want to be honest and say that I think no one's out. I've seen corruption in every area and just like people being perfectly imperfect, right? Of like, we all have places maybe where we can clarify something or fine tune something, and that's going to exist for the rest of our life. But I think when we have certain lenses or filters that we can apply that create a shift where we feel more empowered and we are in the driver's seat of our own happiness, right? Then we're feeling like we can choose life and we can show up. And I think like you were saying, one of the real negative sides of the internet culture we're living in is I think a lot of young people who grew up under cancel culture are really sort of like timid in a certain way that I wasn't. And like, I think even looking back, I'm more timid now because of my success. But when I was like a young person that was just angry and like reckless, a lot of the things I did without thinking about the consequences, those were some of my greatest successes, right? Because people were like, whoa, like that's
Mm.
inspiring. How bold and unfiltered and raw. Like all of my early performance work was just completely unfiltered and raw, and people loved it. But I think there's this sense that like people are losing that a little bit because they're afraid of the consequences of their different internet personas, and they feel like there's a lot of people watching and judging them. And I think the young people for the most part have it figured out, but I also just notice certain things, and I think that's something that's really emerging is like the damage that has done where people are afraid to almost be themselves, right? Because they feel like nothing is safe anymore,
Mhm. Mm. One last question before the final message. I would love to hear about your astro pop-ups and memes too. They're such fascinating expressions, playful, edgy, and potent. How do they fit into your larger astro-feminist practice? What role do they play in your vision?
Yeah, thank you. So no, one thing I do that's kind of like a practice is pretty much every day I try to create a new meme, and that will be taking an aspect of astrology, researching it a little bit, and then finding a celebrity that has that aspect. And I grew up making
Mm.
zines. That was kind of how I had my first feminist kind of take back of my power, right? Of like moving out of like reading all of these magazines and trying to conform or live up to this standard, sort of making my own media and setting my own standards. So I like to create memes that, share about the different aspects and kind of give some spiritual food for thought around how we can see ourselves. And it's not meant to like glorify celebrities, but I find that it's fun to like search
Mhm.
images and kind of create something of deeper meaning out of it. From a lot of times I'm learning about these celebrities through my astrology research, because
Mm.
I am kind of like very out of touch with mainstream culture in certain ways, but it's fun to find that kind of like the proof, right? Of like, okay, Drake's a Scorpio, and actually mainstream culture is very into astrology. So you hear a lot of pop culture talking about astrology and song lyrics and astrology. So it's fun to do that. I like to share that on my Astro Feminist Depot, which is at Midheaven or Not on IG. And then I also have a pop up coming the end of next month, which will be at this big art, like immersive art experience that's put on by Chashama. So that will be the end of June. The last time I was there, I did a pop up where I gave people insights into their natal Venus, right, which is our feminine
Mm.
energy. And then this year, I'm following that up with giving people insights into their natal Mars. So it's going to
Mm.
be a female Mars, because Scorpio is actually the female Mars, Aries is the male Mars, Scorpio is the water aspect of Mars, and Mars and Pluto both rule Scorpio. So it's going to have a bit of more of a feminine spin, but Mars constellates desire, aggression, our, like, the way we assert ourselves, our masculine energy, our sex energy. So I'm going to just kind of get people talking about their Mars energy. And for me, that's been a big part of my physical healing journey too, because I was experiencing like a lot of like inflammation and things with my skin and kind of clearing up. When we're not in touch with our Mars, it's showing up in weird ways. So it can be inflammation, it can be acne, it can also be other people exploding at us in anger. Whereas, that
Mm.
is often like a reflection of our own repressed anger. So that was one thing, I was starting to get in touch with. Like, it's been since I was younger, I knew I wasn't really in touch with my anger. I think I am now. And now I'm like, okay, time to cool it down, But I think that's a big kind of highlight of working with Mars, because there's not a lot of healthy outlets for anger in our culture, and especially for women. And so I feel like people end up kind of, it backfires, like they're taking it out on themselves, and it's becoming chronic inflammation or chronic illness. Or it's like we try to express our anger in a place, and it's usually the wrong place, wrong time, wrong person, right? Like over the phone with some distant telemarketer, where they become the victim of our anger, right? Of like, really the company is, kind of the one that is out of integrity, and then like us human beings are fighting over the scraps, right? Corporations kind of take human rights than the people at this age. So I found that, like, yeah, often, especially in the city, a lot of us are just frustrated, and yet the power struggles happen when it's like the system has already been engineered at our expense, and the real people that are profiting or benefiting off of this are on vacation in Tahiti, right? And we're just like fighting it out over scraps. So yeah, that's just something I'm excited about, is kind of thinking about anger and the female Mars. And that will be a beautiful art party. You can get tickets online. It's called the Chashama Gala, June 21st and 26th. There will be 2 events.
Perfect. I was actually to ask you what are the projects that are lighting you up. So can people who are watching it, whether live or on a replay, can find all of your incredible offerings and projects, collaborations on your Instagram and website? Or please share, where would you like people to
Yeah.
find you and where?
Yeah, so I try to keep my, like I have a link tree on my Instagram where I have usually the most up-to-date links, the links to my art website, where you can see my art, as well as you can buy a personal astro oracle session. Or I also love to do lovers synastry, where I give couples readings and can talk about your past life karma. So usually Instagram is a great place for kind of the most current, where I'm sharing about, this event and other things I'm doing. Yeah, and also my website has a kind of archive of all the things I've done and all of my offerings. I have a yoga website, as well as a more fine art website. But yeah, I would love to kind of help people more in the sense of personal readings, where we could really sit down and go deep. That's something I've been moving more
Mm.
into, because I feel like it's a more effective way to kind of address some long-term issues. Yeah.
Thank you. And the final message, well, for those in our audience, especially women, femmes, and non-binary people engaging with astrology, what do you most hope they remember or reclaim about their own power and connection to the cosmos?
Yeah, I think, like, first things come to mind is getting out of the victim consciousness of like seeing that maybe it's helpful. And, I think first we come to that because we often don't know we've been victimized, especially as femmes or as empaths. First, it's like claiming that wrong has been done to us. So, like, there is this initial stage of that. But I think what's ultimately empowering is to kind of own our own role in the scenario and then start to detach from that experience of the victim and kind of rise up into our power as a leader, as a healer. And part of that is really like honoring the value that we bring, right? So it's like we don't have to forgive people that have hurt us. We actually have to fortify our boundaries and our voice so that we can protect ourselves and we can protect and share, what works for us with other people that are, looking to learn and grow and have a more peaceful experience and move towards bliss and move towards joy, right? Because I feel like there's also this side of us that's like, the world is so messed up that we're not allowed to be happy, and we have to
Mm,
always be, kind of sacrificing our personal happiness um to fight someone else's battle. There's this saying, hold it in your heart, not on your shoulders. So I feel like that, is something, our hearts are always open. We can go into our heart space, into the Anahata heart chakra, and we can embrace everyone, right? Even the people that have done us wrong, the people that we feel that we hate or that really trigger us. We can embrace them in their heart, but we don't have to take on everyone's issues. I think we really need to focus inward so that we can understand what we're bringing and why we're here. So, the second part of that is like, I really want everyone to look into their lunar nodes, which is the kind of shadow of the moon. It's not a planet, it's a point. We also call it the dragon's head and the dragon's tail. So they just indicate to us what is our highest path of soul growth and what is our past life place where we kind of get stuck. And this is where we find that, like, our solution is going to be uniquely ours, and so it helps us to really own where it is and where we are in our journey, and to not get confused if other people are wanting us to be something or do something that maybe isn't in our highest good or in our highest integrity. So it allows us to like sort of separate out the voices of other people and kind of come home to self and then move from that place. It's not to say we aren't going to be in community. We don't need other people. We deeply do. But I think just
mhm,
my experience is kind of losing myself in a lot of relationships and kind of not understanding or valuing why I was here or what I was doing to the degree that I could kind of protect that and create some sustainability. So I think especially for women and female identified persons, it's like that boundary work, that coming home to self. They say the hero's journey like ends in slaying the dragon and getting the girl, but it's almost like the heroine's journey is just like feeling safe and at home
mm,
within yourself, right?
mm. Katie,
Easier said
thank
than
you
done.
from the bottom of my heart. Yes, I love it. Like, it's so beautiful what you're sharing. Uh, those who are watching it, like, remember to keep your hearts open. Remember, you can find all of the answers within you. And remember, it's so important to concentrate on what lights you up and what brings you joy, because it raises vibration. And then by you tapping into that vibration, you are allowing yourself to realize or tap into your own light within. And then you're allowing other people, hopefully, to see the light within themselves. And that creates a ripple effect. And thank you so much for your radiant being, for your presence, and for this beautiful, thoughtful, and inspiring conversation. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. I appreciate you as well. And it's been a real joy and pleasure to be here and share. And I'm excited to kind of check out some of the other speakers. And yeah.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the viewers. Okay, I'm sending everyone lots of love. Goodbye. Bye bye.
Bye.